All right, without further ado, we'll get started. Thank you guys for tuning in here. My name is Nick Simi. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer here in Northeast Ohio with Akron Children's Hospital, and we have an affiliation with the University of Akron here, a MAC program. I'm joined here by Jo Clubb. Very fortunate to have her on here. She's been very influential in my time diving into the sports science realm. Today, we'll be talking about tracking systems and load monitoring. So a little bit about Jo before getting started. She has extensive experience as an applied sports scientist in the European Professional Soccer League, the NHL, Hockey League, and also the NFL organizations. She currently provides consulting services and invaluable information through her Global Performance Insights platform. So again, thank you very much. And as well, she co-authored Chapter 9 of the CPSS textbook for those that have been hopping on with us covering that. So again, thank you for hopping on, and awesome to talk and chat with you today.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, so how the session will go, for the most part, I just put some into the chat. We'll go through some of the questions that we already have prepared. But if you guys have questions in real time, feel free to put them in the chat, and then I'll be moderating those as we go, and then we'll be able to have those asked in real time. So without further ado, we'll get started. Again, some of what we'll talk about today. We'll be looking at handling larger data sets. So we're talking about athlete tracking, and us as sports science professionals, rehab professionals, or performance professionals trying to track and handle this information. What are your recommendations for handling some of these larger data sets? And then how has your data tracking and analysis process been streamlined over the last few years?
Yeah, so this has probably been, even in the 10, 15 years I've been in sports science, one of the biggest, areas of change that we've seen. We were 10 plus years ago, maybe starting to deal with GPS. And of course, now we've got so much data coming in on the tracking side, let alone all the other data streams around testing, monitoring, as well as, the technical, tactical side of things, psychological side. So a number of years ago, I started trying to learn R personally, because I recognized that a bigger part of my role was trying to manage these data sets. That had a real steep learning curve. It was really tough, to be honest. But I did get to a point where certainly I'd written scripts that they were there, they were done, and that improved my workflow day to day, undoubtedly, in terms of just taking the data, putting it all together, putting it in the format I need, and then being able to view it alongside all the other data in the views that I wanted. The other thing that the indirect benefit of that for me was it also made me understand, on a very basic level, data science. So when I then worked in a setting in the NFL, for instance, where we were fortunate to have a lot of resources, obviously not many settings have the same level of resources as an NFL team, but we did have, initially one data scientist, and then that grew to probably a department or 4 or 5. And they then took that on. Obviously, they were building an in-house AMS. They took over a lot of that. But I had enough knowledge to almost be the translator with them, to be able to understand well enough how their job worked and what they needed. And I was then able to kind of be that connector, be that link between all the sports medicine, sports performance, strength and conditioning pieces with them. So actually, for me, the process of learning some level of coding did save me time eventually, once I got to grips with it. But it also gave me that skill set to be able to work with the data scientists. Now, again, things I think have pivoted again, where we are in 2024, where the option when I was looking into it, let's say maybe 8 years ago, was, okay, do I learn R or Python? Well, now it's kind of like, well, do I learn to code with those, or do I learn Power BI, or do I learn Tableau? And now we've got, where does Chat GPT fit into the mix of that? So it's almost even more confusing now, because I think that these large language models like Chat GPT will mean that people probably don't need to learn to code. A good friend of mine is Carlos Balsalobre, who created the My Jump app, the My Sprint app. He taught himself to code and build these apps, which are phenomenal. But even he was showing me the other day, like how um, this software or large language model can just give you the code. Yes, you need that level of knowledge to test what it's giving you, to check for understanding at the moment. Um, but it's an interesting time point to be in, because if you're going to embark on the coding journey now, it may be in a few years' time that we're not really doing it so manually anymore. Um, so I don't want to sit on the fence, because I realize I've probably sat on the fence with that answer. Actually, if I was at a point now where I was handling big data sets and deciding where to go, I think I would probably learn maybe Power BI. That seems to be, or Tableau, that seems to be the trend at the moment. And I think it's because there's a lower entry level. It's simpler than coding, but you can accelerate to interactive dashboards and kind of, as I'm sure we'll talk about, the data visualization and the interactivity and how you adjust that. So yeah, that's, I guess, a long-winded story of my trying to upskill in data science.
No, that's perfect. Daniel Yu, he unfortunately wasn't able to make it on today, but he is proficient in R, and I was asking him the same question as well, like trying to dive into this side that's a little bit more foreign to me. I'm almost overwhelmed with the analytical side just as much as trying to get my footing here into the sports science realm and just from a tracking perspective. So for those that are looking, maybe for instance, to have interest in Power BI and also Tableau, what are some resources or kind of where to begin with that? Like, are there any um, certain courses or resources or things that you found beneficial to help improve that knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's always a mountain of resources on YouTube. Um, uh, when I was doing R, I used DataCamp quite a bit, but I'm not even sure if that's kind of, I think that's still going. But yeah, free resources on YouTube. To be honest, I have my friends have a company called Sport Horizon, and I've done an interview with them on my YouTube channel, and you can get a discount code and stuff like that. They have created courses in this exact space. So Power BI for sports scientists, Tableau for sports scientists, level 1 and 2. I think by the end of this month, Power BI for strength and conditioning coaches is coming out. So there, I would definitely, I'm biased because I know the guys and I really love what they're doing. But I love what they're doing because I think there was a need for it. They identified that people in our field were trying to upskill in this area, and they were relying on the other courses or YouTube videos that use random data sets that aren't, related to our field and the nuances and the context of how a sports setting works. So Sport Horizon would definitely be my first port of call for anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll make sure to put that in the chat here as well for those to reference. So pivoting a little bit from handling larger data sets, moving on to optical tracking systems. So in regards to optical tracking systems, what are some practical applications of different biomechanical data that you can get from these systems that you found useful?
Yeah, so well, I take that question perhaps not necessarily specific to optical tracking per se, because obviously that's kind of your camera systems, but we've got GPS wearables as well. We've got local positioning systems, and the IMUs as well. So kind of I'm taking that more broadly in terms of GPS. and other tracking systems. I think obviously there's a whole host of applications in terms of understanding the big picture of the demands of a sport. And I've been really fortunate to work across like three big team sports, and really I remember kind of my first day in at the Sabres in the NHL, the realization that suddenly everything was on ice, and therefore all my prior knowledge was on land-based athletes. And so yeah, the realization of like, wait, how does this relate, was a bit overwhelming. But of course a lot of the principles do, right? We want to use this external load monitoring to understand the demands of the sport on a competition level, a practice training level, on a season long view, zooming into a week microcycle, or maybe 3 days in hockey, into the session, into the drills. And in terms of, like, that question mentions the biomechanical data. Again, I think this is an interesting area because in terms of the wearables, perhaps, I've definitely used it to kind of look at more detailed stride or gait or skate level. So can we use it to assess left and right strides in terms of load, in terms of asymmetries? There's a bit of caution there, of course, because in terms of a GPS, it's between the shoulder blades. So how accurate can we be about lower limb um, forces? But some of that has been validated and explored, and certainly I've been convinced enough to take a look at some of that information. I also think there's value in. I think those wearables can potentially tell us something about fatigue. I was involved in a paper with Amber Rowell, who works well, she's currently down in Australia, where we were looking at like a standardized small-sided game. And again, that's kind of linking into this sub-maximal fitness test approach of, can we almost test our athletes without testing? Can we understand about changes in fitness or fatigue through this kind of data? And one of the things we found in that study, for instance, was perhaps the slow component of player load, or some of the different planes, because player load is based on the accelerometer, which is like a ball in a box. Harjeev will be cringing at my attempt at explaining things, but a ball in a box, and we're looking at the different planes of motion, the different directions. If you think about when you're fatigued, um, you know, most of us, we do slouch over. The body naturally slouches over to try and conserve energy. It's actually called groucho running. It's been studied. And so the change in posture, perhaps the device, the wearable, is changing. And so can we start to identify that? Now, that is obviously at a much deeper level, and there's a lot of noise associated there, than just saying, this is the distance and speed that we hit today. But particularly, again, with this advent of, or evolution of, AI, maybe these are the kinds of avenues of biomechanical analysis we can go down and get more insight out of the data that's already being collected. And that's the kind of stuff that I get excited about.
Is there any, like, in terms of the location of some of these accelerometers or positional units, is there like a preferred location that you'd be interested in having some of these like newer devices or technologies be placed, or is it something more about trying to lean into kind of what we already know about where the position is, maybe in between the shoulder blades?
Yeah, it's a good question. I kind of have two answers, because if you're doing it with, say, GPS that we already have, then I would say we need to use it in the manufacturer recommended position, you know. Now that's sometimes harder to do than you think, because uh, we're always trying to compromise on practicality with precision, right? I call it the practicality precision trade-off. So for instance, when I was in the NFL and in hockey, actually, they would wear the devices in a pouch in the jerseys over the top of pads. Some days, other days they're not wearing pads. You know, it's not in the manufacturer vest on the body in that precise position. There's going to be more noise. So I would be I would be more cautious in that setting. Now, that said, in an ideal world, I've seen some interesting stuff recently on insoles. A couple of companies I've spoken to about instrumented insoles. I think that actually has potential. You know, you're actually inside the foot, in each foot. As someone with a history of ACL injury myself, because I'm a female soccer player, you know I run differently left and right. So even just anecdotally, I think it's interesting. But again, the logistics of that is now the challenge, the practicality of that. You know, in soccer, some players have 5 different pairs of cleats. How do I know which ones they're going to wear on that day? How do I charge them? How do I get them out? What happens when they change cleats during a game? Again, I think there's a great deal of interest in the science there, but we also have to think about the practicality and the implementation of it.
Then you'll have an athlete that says that they forgot and then they lost the
Yeah.
insole. Yeah, right. So moving along with having some of those systems in place, handling larger sets of data, now trying to track change and talking a little bit more about that applied piece. So for instance, you can take this, you know, with whatever tracking system that you'd like. For instance, GPS, global positioning, when flagging for change in certain GPS metrics, is there a certain statistic or threshold that you like to set, like whether that's a z-score, t-score, if there's a standard deviation? You know, what
Mm-hmm.
are kind of some things that you look for from a statistical side? And then you know, I'll follow up with maybe like a particular metric example.
Yeah. Again, there's lots of options available to us. Percent change, acute chronic, of course, that's a whole can of worms in itself. Smallest worthwhile change. I have to say, and there's probably not one clear-cut way. There's not one wrong and right way. I personally am a big fan of Z-scores. And actually, I think a lot of people are, because I wrote a blog and I've done a video on it, and they are 2 of my most popular things I've ever done in terms of explaining a Z-score in the context of sports science. I just think you know, it's a simple statistic that we can have in the background that gives us an idea of what today was like for an individual compared to their norm. Now, I don't report the Z score. Coaches are not getting a report with various Z scores on them. But what I tend to have is, again, a system set up, whether that's in the software of the tracking system itself, whether it's an Excel or an athlete management system, whereby you're not only looking at an individual compared to themselves, because I think that's important for a start, compare individuals to themselves. If you don't have individuals data, if they're a new athlete, then start with a positional comparison whilst you build their individual data set. I then like to add the next layer of context, which is whatever today is, whether today is, you know, a game day -3, or in football, it was, you know, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So we would always compare a Wednesday type practice to themselves. In soccer, it's commonly like a strength, resistance, speed, reactions, or whatever model you have. Can you tag your days so that we can look at, okay, for this athlete on this kind of a day in season, how did they compare to themselves? And as I said, that's in the background. And then we can use conditional formatting or some sort of alerting system that when it is above or below a certain threshold of z-score, it is flagged. Now, again, it's a whole nother debate. Well, what z-score do you use? I tend to go with plus 1.5 to minus 1.5. And again, I try to avoid red and green because it's not necessarily good or bad. Most of the time there's a good explanation for why it was significantly higher or lower, but it's that context, and it's just flagging, okay, did you realize that this athlete has done a lot more than they normally do on this kind of a day? And again, we can then zoom out a bit and look at, okay, acute load. Okay, this week we can do the exact same thing. Is this week, how does this week's training load for that athlete compare to their norm? How does this 4 week or month or 2 week block, whatever it might be? Again, there's no right or wrong answer, unfortunately. But how does that block compare to their norm? And it's just contextual understanding of how their training load is progressing.
And one thing to go off of that too, and I'm personally really curious about this with, so here, at least at like the university that I'm at, there hasn't been much, data tracking or really any systems or frameworks that are in place. So the big question that I have is, outside of just one data point, which might not be extremely helpful in tracking change, like you said, to kind of have that invisible monitoring piece, how many data sets or let's say GPS data would you say is enough to generate a trend?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if it's the first time that you're tracking them or the first season that you're going about implementing some of this information, like how much is enough to start, like maybe not attaching yourself to one metric, but starting to say like, all right, well, that's significant for what we see in that athlete? Or is it just, we just don't have enough data points? There might not be a set number, but like, how do you kind of
Yeah,
create that in a place that might not have that
yeah,
infrastructure?
and of course, very different in a context in a clinic setting where you're seeing individuals every few months, perhaps. Um, in terms initially in like the day-to-day team sports setting, we did some analysis at one point about how many data points does it take to establish the norm. And I think it was something like 6 or 9 sessions in our data set, in our setting, which meant, so although, that's essentially a third of the season in the NFL, if not half. But yeah, we would be looking at comparing someone to a positional average for a minimum probably of 5 6 weeks before then translating over. But of course, remembering, for instance, that if you're using preseason data, they might then be constantly flagging lower because of the context of comparing it. Well, that's not in season, right? So again, always, it's not necessarily wrong to do it that way, but to remember that context so you can explain that away. Again, in the second half of the season in the NFL, teams tend to reduce their training loads quite a lot. Some teams stop doing padded sessions. And certainly towards the end of the season, we would often have more regularly players being flagged for doing significantly less. But that was almost a trend we wanted to see at that time of the year. Or in a week where we said, no, we're going to keep it really light this week. That's something we want to see. So flags aren't always necessarily bad. In a clinic setting where people are coming and going, obviously, unfortunately can't give you a magic number there, but I think that's where perhaps where you would more commonly look across norms of the population. And then you would look at something like a percentage change, where the beauty of a Z score is it considers, because it's their individual average and their standard deviation from their whole data set, you get an idea of the range, whether it's some athletes might be very consistent, some might be all over the place, so you get an idea of today versus the whole data set. If that data set is not very big, then perhaps just doing a percent change from that time point to that time point might be more valuable, as well, of course, as then looking at, or whatever it is. Again, maybe we're now talking a little bit more in terms of testing and screening. Are there kind of more generic norms or baselines that we can get from the research for that particular data collection?
Yeah, that's extremely helpful, because that's something where we're trying to launch it with, with our hospital, and then also the exercise science department, and then the athletic department of our affiliation with the college program. So we're trying to get it implemented into the college or in the university, but can be overwhelming, and not necessarily start to make decisions too early based on
Yeah.
what we're seeing. So I think, yeah, that's something that's really helpful. And then maybe a little piece here in terms of a metric. Again, it can be a little controversial, and then depending upon the unit that you're using, but like a GPS metric or metrics such as high speed running or maybe accelerations and decelerations, are there certain thresholds that you like to set? And again, it context dependent, sport dependent. But is there an example of, like, we like to set in this context a certain speed threshold in order to have it designate as their high speed running, or you know the um, the acceleration or deceleration metric as well, like certain thresholds for those?
Yeah, again, it depends. Sorry, boring answer, but it's true. It depends on the sport, it depends on the age group, it depends on the um, sex of the athlete, the population. So I would say, um, with thresholds, I mean, then they're naturally limited anyway, right? Like, they are not an ideal solution because they treat everything in that bucket the same. So if you're, and I think we have a couple of figures in the textbook actually kind of highlighting this. If you're just one side of the threshold and then just the other side, those 2 points are treated completely differently. And whereas a data point that's in that same bucket but at the other end of the scale is treated the same. So anytime we're bucketing continuous data is not ideal, but it's what we have to do. So yeah, I would be asking the tracking providers what their recommendations are for your population and sport. I would be looking in the literature at what is most commonly used, not because it's necessarily right, but that's going to give you more of a framework and more comparison points if you do want to then use the research. I think there's a really interesting debate around absolute thresholds versus relative. So do you set it at 5.5 meters per second or 21 kilometers per hour or whatever the units are that you're using, and have that, which is more common in the research, versus do you then use relative thresholds whereby you're saying 65% or 80% of an individual's max speed are our buckets. Now that seems fairer, seems more accurate for between athlete comparisons. But even that is not without its challenges, like, okay, we're going to base it off of max speed, but how do we determine that max speed? Are we going to do it are we going to do max speed runs? Or are we going to take it from games? How often are we going to update it? What about if you've got a player who hasn't hit that max speed or near that max speed for 3 years? Um, so I think the point is that, like, even choosing a threshold is not necessarily a simple decision. You have to be a bit critical of it and intentional around, okay, why am I choosing this? Because Ideally, once you've chosen it, you don't want to be making changes for consistency, for data analysis over time, unless you've got a really strong justification. So you want to get it right. I would say where there's perhaps an exception, so that's kind of like load monitoring over time. Um, one of the more general rules of thumb that I would say I have used are regular high speed exposures in field running team sport athletes um, for trying to mitigate hamstring injury risk. So I would use a 90% threshold and track when was the last time every athlete ran over 90% of their max speed. If they haven't done so in the last 7 to 10 days, we might be looking to incorporate a drill into practice that encourages them to do that. We might be having a quiet word in their ear and just saying, look, if you get the chance to open up, not telling them to go out and sprint, but depending on the athlete, if we have that relationship, particularly if they've got a hamstring injury risk history, or we've identified them as a hamstring injury risk. So that would be something that's a bit more generic that I would track. Again, you probably want to do it actually over 95% because EMG shows that the activation in the hamstrings is actually different again at the really fast speeds. But I think a mixture of being cautious with these athletes in that setting and also technology error, which is a factor at high speeds, means that I've always been a little bit uh, more cautious. But again, ideally, you have a data system set up where you can type in or go to a drop down menu and say, right, show me a table of how many days it's been since all the players hit 95%. And then we can type in our drop down, okay, now show me for 90%. So that might be a bit more general rule of thumb that I do like to integrate.
Yeah, that's excellent too. And kind of taking that information that you have and communicating that to a staff or visualizing that to a staff. What are some different changes that you would make to that visualization process? You know, whether it's high speed running, that individual has a higher likelihood of re-injury of a hamstring strain. How are you communicating some of that visually to a sport performance staff versus the sport coach and the medical staff? Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. But what are maybe a case example of where you've been before in terms of how you just made maybe some small changes to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's an important one. I've always been aware that I have like this hierarchy of information for different key stakeholders. So I'm on the bottom. I see everything. Um, then the next level up, perhaps is the performance director. Like he doesn't need to see, or she, depending on who you're working with, maybe they're the kind. It's always about knowing the people, what they like, what they need. So like a performance director I worked with, he was like, I don't need to see everything. I'll go down rabbit holes. Like I want to see more than what some people see, but like it's not as much as me, for instance. Then you've got maybe strength and conditioning coaches and your medics. Again, medics maybe see more information on the rehab players, of course. And then the coaches, of which is really streamlined and really kind of just the key things. I think a lot of people now very proudly share these nice dashboards that they have, which is great. And as we talked about that in the very first question, but I certainly wouldn't be showing the head coach the same as what I'm seeing because I even if they are really data savvy and really interested and engaged with sports science, they're also probably engaged with all the other departments, and so you're potentially overwhelming them or clouding what they need to do. So, one of the places that I felt I've had the biggest impact in my career was somewhere where I made the least reports. And one of the coaches I feel like I had like one of the best relationships with, and I genuinely felt like, I made a difference, was someone who I hardly even gave a paper report to, because they would just say to me, tell me what I need to know. They wanted a verbal summary, and they just wanted to know, tell me what I need to action. And so initially I was devastated because I got all my pretty reports and they don't want to see them. But I realized that that is a factor. That's a reflection of trust. Like in that case, they trusted that I had the evidence. They trusted the process I went to come to my opinion and to my decisions. And then they just wanted to know, what actions do I need to take? So yes, definitely different levels of information for each key stakeholder. And ideally for each person, it's delivered in a way that suits them. You know, like I said, that coach was verbal. I've had a strength coach I work with who says, I want you to print on paper every day the report. I need it on paper. I need to see it. You'll have other coaches who will embrace logging in and being interactive on dashboards. And we need to ideally try and be flexible to all this and deliver the information in the way that each user prefers to consume it.
And I think it comes back to that piece, like you mentioned before, and it's a way that you can streamline your processes, understanding that style, and then you don't have to go through the process of having that report and then not having to use it after you spend all that time. So I definitely can feel you on that. But yeah, absolutely, very valuable there to understand, and then um, yeah, I think to have it individualized for each individual and just having a simple conversation with them just helps to build that relationship and that connection outside of just having the data. And then, so lastly here, last question, then we'll open up for a few questions. So we have some of this visualization piece, like you said, some people just wanted to know some of the insights. Some of them wanted to have a physical report. Um, in regards to contact sports, how are you driving some actionable changes to the use of gyroscopes or some of this contact or collision data that's starting to come
Mhm.
out and become more popular? Have you seen that been able to be tracked and have changes be made with that information?
Yeah, that's definitely evolved in the last, again, 5, 6, 7 years or so, to a point now, again, where, if it's a wearable device, for instance, in hockey, they're quantifying the number of collisions. I know in football they've done a lot of work trying to establish lineman metrics, and it's very clever, using machine learning to identify, okay, when they're in their stance, and then identifying, okay, that contact within that time frame then is a collision. Um, which is progress. But again, a lot of, in that case, in the case of Lyman, a lot of their contact is like this grappling, wrestling. It's isometric, a lot of it, put simply. So yes, we might get the initial collision through an accelerometer, um, but anything thereafter is really challenging to quantify through a wearable. um I've almost thought like maybe we could get like the EMG shorts or something that is showing how hard they're working, and not relying on movement, because so much of it is like limited movement and doesn't justify how much work they're doing. So actually, I, in the past, have relied more greatly with RPE and maybe heart rate. Again, heart rate is practically difficult, especially in a football setting where you've got guys this big and guys this big, and the belts, juggling that is even harder in that sport. But I think some sort of internal load measure right now of an athlete, either through their heart rate or ideally through them saying, do you know what, that was really tough, I mean, the funny thing is linemen often just say 10 every day, but it is a hard job, you know? So, yeah, I'm not sure we're quite there yet with wearables. And again, hopefully it's something that it's an area that we can make progress with.
Yeah, I can only imagine them walking in every day and saying 10 and reluctantly putting that down on paper or having to kind of get a little bit more information out of them to be like, all right, what is it really today? You have to have that
Yeah,
follow.
well, then when they say 11, I say, see, now if you said 10 every day, this is the day it needs to be 10. Um,
You might need
but
to have
yeah.
a bigger RPE scale for the offensive lineman. It sounds like expanded version. So I really appreciate you going through some of those questions. Without further ado, I would want to open up for questions here from the audience. If you have any questions, feel free. You can unmute or ask, or if you're unable to do so, you can throw them in the chat and I'll be able to ask them here. So any questions from the group?
Covered everything.
Hope we got
Oh.
someone here. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Nick. Thank you for this session.
Of course, thanks for tuning in.
You're welcome. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Joe, just considering the amount of experience you have and all the different sports that you've worked with, it's a very generic question, but this is a challenge that I'm currently facing right now. Is there any AMS that you would recommend for team sports and individual sports? So with my current project director, we are facing this issue where number one, just ensuring that the data is collected. That's something that I have to drive right now from a monitoring perspective. So not just from a sports science team, but I also have to request the coaches because some of them are very old school. They just want to, follow whatever they have on their board. They don't want to do any objective monitoring from a technical or tactical perspective. So that's something, even though that's not supposed to be a job, I'm trying to drive that. So there are all these data points coming into the picture. And while I understand right now and I'm working with an Excel, I know down the line it may get a little bit difficult to streamline on that. And because I'm not always on the field with them, the best way would that was my thought at that time, that let's just work with an AMS, and then that's what my project director is also driving. So would you have any recommendations in terms both for team sports and individual sports? Or if you have any other alternate, then if you would say that, okay, if not an AMS, then what else would you recommend? Yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, really, really pertinent because obviously, as we talked about, like data management is probably our biggest challenge nowadays. And do you know what? A lot of AMSs have popped up and a lot of them have failed to deliver and perhaps overpromised. Ideal world, and I straight away am going to acknowledge that this is like NFL resource level, so it's not for the majority. Ideal world, you build in-house, you develop something yourself because you then have full control over it. If we don't have the resources and the manpower to do that, there's one that's caught my eye, and I've spoken to them a little bit. I think is quite interesting. Is called the company is called Action Apps. I think their product might be called Power AMS. But why I say that one is because so they're based off of Microsoft. So they might be struggling right now with the outages, but generally everything is built around that. They build the back end for you, but the front end is all based on Microsoft Power BI. So if you have the skill set, like we were talking about earlier, if you dive into the Sport Horizon courses, then and learn that skill set, you then have the ability to personalize that AMS exactly how you want it. You become the developer of it without having to learn those back end skills. You still get the support from that company, but it just stands out to me a little bit different to all these other off the shelf companies who are just building the same thing for every client. And when you request something, you go into a queue for, you know, who they're gonna whoever, whatever request is the most popular, they work on next. But I think that's why, to me, action apps is quite interesting, because they'll build that back end, and they have the functionality. If you're dealing with different settings, different sports, you've got coaches from different teams inputting things, like it sounds like you are, they can set that up however you need. But as I said, you can then build upon that. So I think that one is definitely worth looking at.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Sorry, I have one more question. Okay, no, I'm Chase, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Joe, for your time. I have a quick question. What if you do want to go through the backdoor route as far as like learning the foundational skills, not into great detail as some other professionals, but just kind of having those foundational skills just so you can come up with the correct questions that you have when you're collecting data or you're trying to learn different things in like Power BI and all the other different systems that you name. What would be the best route to go if you do want to kind of have a little bit of foundation?
In terms of like more of the data science, data engineering side of things?
Yes, kind of like what you did. You explained kind of
Mm-hmm.
you taught yourself and you learned different things, but you said now kind of going into the future, you don't necessarily have to have those strong foundational skills. And, you know, you mentioned some of the courses, but what if you do want to kind of have that as a background? Because I think for me, if you have somewhat of that foundational skills, it just prompts you to ask more questions and to dig more into different things versus not knowing at all.
Yeah, I think there are, I feel like some IBM courses are coming to mind. I'm trying to think of I don't know if any of you know Ash Anand, who used to work at Seattle, and he's always doing all these certifications. I think there are kind of introduction to data science level courses that are all these online ones. So I'd be looking at that kind of introduction level to, yeah, introduction to data science. There's loads of textbooks out there as well. I'm sure there'll be loads on YouTube. But if you actually want to go down that route, that would be a start. But just be aware that it's a steep learning curve would be my one bit of advice. Don't get put off by that. If you can, do it with someone else, or have someone who has those skills, who can kind of keep you going when it gets really tough. It's basically like learning a foreign language, and you almost don't understand what you're trying to achieve at certain points. But yeah, I would be searching for introduction to data science courses.
Thank you.
I have one more question, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, when it comes to testing and monitoring, if you could just advise on where to place IMTP testing, right? If it can be used as a monitoring tool, and are there any situations where you would not recommend it? Because currently looking at like current practices at the literature, as of now, I've not seen any cons for it when compared to other traditional testing methods. But I would like to understand if there are any situations you've come across where you would not have recommended it, whether it was because of the season or certain incidences or situations, like the context and nuance would be better explained by you.
So yeah, isometric mid-thigh pull. I am a big fan. I am biased towards it as a simple, non-fatiguing test of global strength. And I also think, although particularly recently there's been some research that questions this, but generally speaking, you can look at the force created in the mid-thigh pull against the force created in the dynamic movement and say, okay, do they need to work more on strength, or do they need to work more on their ballistic capabilities? again, there's limitations to that. I would never make that decision solely based on the test results, but I think it's a pretty simple way to see, okay, are their test results backing up what we see on the field or in the weight room? When I did bring it in the football setting, so American football, and at that time most players were unfamiliar with it. So I would say you have to be careful around familiarity. If people don't know the technique, particularly if they haven't done weightlifting, and so they don't know sort of the clean position and things like this, people can, there's always a danger whenever you're doing any kind of exercise that people don't know for injury. Some athletes who have a history of back injuries find it very uncomfortable. And so there would be one or two athletes that we maybe wouldn't do it with. But generally speaking, I am a fan of it, and I would just always do, when you come to test, I would do 50% warm up, 75% warm up, and 2 maximal reps. If they've never done it before, you maybe do a week before, you just do submaximal familiarization tests. That would be my protocol: 2 progressive warm-up reps, 2 maximal reps. You want to be careful. The mid-thigh pull can potentiate athletes, and therefore they could arguably perform better if you then do a counter movement jump afterwards. So for instance, I would always do a counter movement jump before the mid-thigh pull, so that's never a factor. If I'm sometimes going to pull and sometimes not, then it could be a factor. So let's just put the jump beforehand, then it doesn't matter. Anything else? So that would be my caution. The other thing is some athletes, grip strength can be a limiting factor. If you do it with straps or chalk on the hands, they will perform better. So that needs to be consistent throughout. And there is growing interest in, like, rather than the mid-thigh pull, doing a squat, or what's the other one? The belt squat as well. So, but it's not much research, but I could see some of those becoming quite popular as well. I hope that is useful.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I also threw in too, there's a lot of great resources, but Bald has a practitioner's guide to isometrics with some normative information, some case-by-case information too, just, a good general resource.
I have more questions as well.
Yeah, perfect. We'll be able to take one more here. Awesome.
Okay, yeah, sure. You mentioned the Sports Horizon educational platform. Are there any other platforms you recommend that kind of dive into the sports science realm?
My own, if I may, if that's not too cheesy. Yeah, I'm doing everything sort of open access. My blog, YouTube channel, Global Performance Insights, trying to just get as much stuff out there. So, likes, subscribers, all things like that are always very useful. Sportsmith, of course, is like the cornerstone, in my opinion. And then not so much nowadays, but maybe I've just gone off it. But I have to say, Twitter, now X, was always very useful for me for finding research, seeing debates about research, and practice. And then having a ResearchGate account. People don't always know what ResearchGate is, but it's free. And if you don't have like an academic access to journal subscriptions and therefore struggle to get papers, ResearchGate, most of the time you can just request the full text from the author. So if it's actual, research publications you're interested in, then definitely it's a no-brainer having a ResearchGate account as well.
Thank you.
Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Joe, thank you so much again for taking the time. It was awesome coordinating this, getting a chance to finally meet. And thank you all for tuning in as well. So Daniel and I have put together a CPSS study group that we have on Facebook, and we also will be putting more information out through LinkedIn. Overwhelmed by the support that we have and individuals like yourself, Joe, to be able to hop on and share your insight. So I appreciate everyone for hopping on. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the chat, and I'll make sure to post some of those answers maybe in the group, or find some resources to help lead you guys to that answer. So if you guys don't have anything further or no other questions to put in the chat, thank you guys again and have a great weekend.